Symbolism from sense perception to physical bodies is the most natural and widespread of all symbolic modes. It is not a mere tropism or automatic turning towards, because both men and puppies often disregard chairs when they see them. Also, a tulip which turns to the light has probably the very minimum of sense presentation. I shall argue on the assumption that sense perception is mainly a characteristic of more advanced organisms, whereas all organisms have experience of causal efficacy, whereby their functioning is conditioned by their environment. In fact, symbolism is very largely concerned with the use of pure sense perceptions in the character of symbols for more primitive elements in our experience. Accordingly, since sense perceptions of any importance are characteristic of high-grade organisms, I shall chiefly confine this study of symbolism to the influence of symbolism on human life. It is a general principle that low-grade characteristics are better studied first in connection with correspondingly low-grade organisms, in which those characteristics are not obscured by more developed types of functioning. Conversely, high-grade characters should be studied first in connection with those organisms in which they first come to full perfection. The 19th century exaggerated the power of the historical method and assumed as a matter of course that every character should be studied only in its embryonic stage. Thus, for example, love has been studied among the savages and latterly among the morons. There is one great difference between symbolism and direct knowledge. Direct experience is infallible. What you have experienced, you have experienced. But symbolism is very fallible in the sense that it may induce actions, feelings, emotions, and beliefs about things which are mere notions without that exemplification in the world which the symbolism leads us to presuppose. I shall develop the thesis that symbolism is an essential factor in the way we function as the result of our direct knowledge. Successful high-grade organisms are only possible on the condition that their symbolic functionings are usually justified so far as important issues are concerned. But the errors of mankind equally spring from symbolism. It is the task of reason to understand and purge the symbols on which humanity depends. An adequate account of human mentality requires an explanation of 1. How we can truly know, 2. How we can err, 3. How we can critically distinguish truth from error. Such an explanation requires that we distinguish that type of mental functioning by which its nature yields immediate acquaintance with fact, from that type of functioning which is only trustworthy by reason of its satisfaction of certain criteria provided by the first type of functioning. I shall maintain that the first type of functioning is properly to be called direct recognition, and the second type symbolic reference. I shall also endeavor to illustrate the doctrine that all human symbolism, however superficial it may seem, is ultimately to be reduced to trains of this fundamental symbolic reference, trains which finally connect percepts in alternative modes of direct recognition. After this prefatory explanation, we must start from a formal definition of symbolism. The human mind is functioning symbolically when some components of its experience elicit consciousness, beliefs, emotions, and usages respecting other components of its experience. The former set of components are the symbols, and the latter set constitute the meaning of the symbols. The organic functioning whereby there is transition from the symbol to the meaning will be called symbolic reference. This symbolic reference is the active synthetic element contributed by the nature of the percipient. It requires a ground founded on some community between the natures of symbol and meaning. But such a common element in the two natures does not of itself necessitate symbolic reference, nor does it decide which shall be symbol and which shall be meaning, nor does it secure that the symbolic reference shall be immune from producing errors and disasters for the percipient. We must conceive perception in the light of a primary phase in the self-production of an occasion of actual existence. In defense of this notion of self-production, arising out of some primary given phase, I would remind you that apart from it, there can be no moral responsibility. The potter, and not the pot, is responsible for the shape of the pot. An actual occasion arises as the bringing together into one context diverse perceptions, diverse feelings, diverse purposes, and other diverse activities, arising out of those primary perceptions. Here activity is another name for self-production. Experience as activity. In this way we assign to the percipient an activity in the production of its own experience, although that moment of experience, in its character of being that one occasion, is nothing else than the percipient itself. Thus, for the percipient at least, the perception is an internal relationship between itself and the things perceived. In analysis, the total activity involved in perception of the symbolic reference must be referred to the percipient. Such symbolic reference requires something in common between symbol and meaning, which can be expressed without reference to the perfected percipient. But it also requires some activity of the percipient which can be considered without recourse, either to the particular symbol or its particular meaning. Considered by themselves, the symbol and its meaning do not require either that there shall be a symbolic reference between the two, or that the symbolic reference between the members of the couple should be one way on rather than the other way on. The nature of their relationship does not in itself determine which is symbol and which is meaning. There are no components of experience which are only symbols or only meanings. The more usual symbolic reference is from the less primitive component as symbol to the more primitive as meaning. This statement is the foundation of a thoroughgoing realism. It does away with any mysterious element in our experience, which is merely meant and thereby behind the veil of direct perception. It proclaims the principle that symbolic reference holds between two components in a complex experience, each intrinsically capable of direct recognition. Any lack of such conscious, analytical recognition is the fault of the defect in mentality on the part of a comparatively low-grade percipient. Language. To exemplify the inversion of symbol and meaning, consider language and the things meant by language. A word is a symbol, but a word can be either written or spoken. Now, on occasions, a written word may suggest the corresponding spoken word, and that sound may suggest a meaning. In such an instance, the written word is a symbol and its meaning is the spoken word. And the spoken word is a symbol and its meaning is the dictionary meaning of the word, spoken or written. But often the written word effects its purpose without the intervention of the spoken word. Accordingly, then, the written word directly symbolizes the dictionary meaning. But so fluctuating and complex is human experience that in general neither of these cases is exemplified in the clear-cut way which is set out here. Often the written word suggests both the spoken word and also the meaning, and the symbolic reference is made clearer and more definite by the additional reference of the spoken word to the same meaning. Analogously, we can start from the spoken word which may elicit a visual perception of the written word. Further, why do we say that the word tree, spoken or written, is a symbol to us for trees? Both the word itself and trees themselves enter into our experience on equal terms, and it would be just as sensible viewing the question abstractedly for trees to symbolize the word tree as for the word to symbolize the trees. This is certainly true, and human nature sometimes works that way. For example, if you are a poet and wish to write a lyric on trees, you will walk into the forest in order that the trees may suggest the appropriate words. Thus, for the poet in his ecstasy or perhaps agony of composition, the trees are the symbols and the words are the meaning. He concentrates on the trees in order to get at the words. But most of us are not poets, though we read their lyrics with proper respect. For us, the words are the symbols which enable us to capture the rapture of the poet in the forest. The poet is a person for whom visual sights and sounds and emotional experiences refer symbolically to words. The poet's readers are people for whom his words refer symbolically to the visual sights and sounds and emotions he wants to evoke. Thus, in the use of language, there is a double symbolic reference from things to words on the part of the speaker and from words back to things on the part of the listener. When in an act of human experience there is a symbolic reference, there are in the first place two sets of components with some objective relationship between them. And this relationship will vary greatly in different instances. In the second place, the total constitution of the percipient has to effect the symbolic reference from one set of components, the symbols, to the other set of components, the meaning. In the third place, the question as to which set of components forms the symbols, and which set the meaning, also depends on the peculiar constitution of that act of experience. Our perception of the external world is divided into two types of content. One type is the familiar immediate presentation of the contemporary world by means of our projection of our immediate sensations, determining for us characteristics of contemporary physical entities. This type is the experience of the immediate world around us. A world decorated by sense data dependent on the immediate states of relevant parts of our bodies. Physiology establishes this latter fact conclusively. Sense datum is a modern term. Hume uses the word impression. There are no bare sensations which are first experienced and then projected into our feet as their feelings or onto the opposite wall as its color. The projection is an integral part of the situation, quite as original as sense data. Our perception is not confined to the universal characters. We do not perceive disembodied color or disembodied extensiveness. We perceive the wall's color and extensiveness. The experienced fact is color away on the wall for us. Thus the color and the spatial perspective are abstract entities, characterizing the concrete way in which the wall enters into our experience. They are therefore relational elements between the percipient at that moment and that other equally actual entity or set of entities which we call the wall at the moment. This spatial relationship is equally essential to both wall and percipient, but the color side of the relationship is at that moment indifferent to the wall, though it is part of the makeup of the percipient. In this sense, and subject to their spatial relationship, contemporary events happen independently. I call this type of experience presentational immediacy. It expresses how contemporary events are relevant to each other, and yet preserve a mutual independence. Our experience, so far as it is primarily concerned with our direct recognition of a solid world of other things which are actual in the same sense that we are actual, has three main independent modes, each contributing its share of components to our individual rise into one concrete moment of human experience. Two of these modes of experience I will call perceptive, and the third I will call the mode of conceptual analysis. In respect to pure perception, I call one of the two types concerned the mode of presentational immediacy, and the other the mode of causal efficacy. Both presentational immediacy and causal efficacy introduce into human experience components which are again analyzable into actual things of the actual world, and into abstract attributes, qualities, and relations which express how those other actual things contribute themselves as components to our individual experience. These abstractions express how other actualities are component objects for us. I will therefore say that they objectify for us the actual things in our environment. Of the two distinct perceptive modes, one mode objectifies actual things under the guise of presentational immediacy, and the other mode, which I have not yet discussed, objectifies them under the guise of causal efficacy. The synthetic activity whereby these two modes are fused into one perception is what I have called symbolic reference. By symbolic reference, the various actualities disclosed respectively by the two modes are either identified or at least correlated together as interrelated elements in our environment. The result of symbolic reference is what the actual world is for us, as that datum in our experience productive of feelings, emotions, satisfactions, actions, and finally as the topic for conscious recognition when our mentality intervenes with its conceptual analysis. Direct recognition is conscious recognition of a percept in a pure mode, devoid of symbolic reference. Symbolic reference may be in many respects erroneous. By this I mean that some direct recognition disagrees in its report of the actual world with the conscious recognition of the fused product resulting from symbolic reference. Thus error is primarily the product of symbolic reference and not of conceptual analysis. Also, symbolic reference itself is not primarily the outcome of conceptual analysis, though it is greatly promoted by it, for symbolic reference is still dominant in experience when such mental analysis is at a low ebb. We all know Aesop's fable of the dog who dropped a piece of meat to grasp at its reflection in the water. Aesop's dog lost his meat, but he gained a step on the road towards a free imagination. This symbolic reference must be explained antecedently to conceptual analysis, although there is a strong interplay between the two, whereby they promote each other. Personally, I prefer to restrict mentality to those experiential activities, which include concepts in addition to percepts. But much of our perception is due to the enhanced subtlety arising from a concurrent conceptual analysis. Thus, in fact, there is no proper line to be drawn between the physical and the mental constitution of experience, but there is no conscious knowledge, apart from the intervention of mentality in the form of conceptual analysis. It will be necessary later on to make some slight reference to conceptual analysis, but at present I must assume consciousness and its partial analysis of experience, and return to the two modes of pure perception. The point that I want to make here is that the reason why low-grade, purely physical organisms cannot make mistakes is not primarily their absence of thought, but their absence of presentational immediacy. Aesop's dog, who was a poor thinker, made a mistake by reason of an erroneous symbolic reference from presentational immediacy to causal efficacy. In short, truth and error dwell in the world by reason of synthesis. Every actual thing is synthetic, and symbolic reference is one primitive form of synthetic activity whereby what is actual arises from its given phases. Roles of sense data in space in presentational immediacy. By presentational immediacy, I mean what is usually termed sense perception, but I am using the former term under limitations and extensions which are foreign to the common use of the latter term. Presentational immediacy is our immediate perception of the contemporary external world, appearing as an element constitutive of our own experience. In this appearance, the world discloses itself to be a community of actual things, which are actual in the same sense as we are. This appearance is affected by the mediation of qualities, such as colors, sounds, tastes, etc., which can with equal truth be described as our sensations or as the qualities of the actual things which we perceive. These qualities are thus relational between the perceiving subject and the perceived things. They can thus be isolated only by abstracting them from their implication in the scheme of spatial relatedness of the perceived things to each other and to the perceiving subject. This relatedness of spatial extension is a complete scheme, impartial between the observer and the perceived things. It is the scheme of the morphology of the complex organisms, forming the community of the contemporary world. The way in which each actual physical organism enters into the makeup of its contemporaries has to conform to this scheme. Thus, the sense data, such as colors, etc., or bodily feelings, introduce the extended physical entities into our experience under perspectives provided by this spatial scheme. The spatial relations by themselves are generic abstractions, and the sense data are generic abstractions. But the perspectives of the sense data provided by the spatial relations are the specific relations whereby the external contemporary things are to this extent part of our experience. These contemporary organisms, thus introduced as objects into experience, include the various organs of the body, and the sense data are then called bodily feelings. The bodily organs and those other external things which make important contributions to this mode of our perception together form the contemporary environment of the percipient organism. The main facts about presentational immediacy are 1. That the sense data involved depend on the percipient organism and its spatial relations to the perceived organisms. 2. That the contemporary world is exhibited as extended and as a plenum of organisms. 3. That presentational immediacy is an important factor in the experience of only a few high-grade organisms, and that for the others it is embryonic or entirely negligible. Thus, the disclosure of a contemporary world by presentational immediacy is bound up with the disclosure of the solidarity of actual things by reason of their participation in an impartial system of spatial extension. Beyond this, the knowledge provided by pure presentational immediacy is vivid, precise, and barren. It is also to a large extent controllable at will. I mean that one moment of experience can predetermine to a considerable extent by inhibitions, or by intensifications, or by other modifications, the characteristics of the presentational immediacy in succeeding moments of experience. This mode of perception, taken purely by itself, is barren, because we may not directly connect the qualitative presentations of other things with any intrinsic characters of those things. We see the image of a colored chair, presenting to us the space behind a mirror, yet we thereby gain no knowledge concerning any intrinsic characters of spaces behind the mirror. But the image thus seen in a good mirror is just as much an immediate presentation of color, qualifying the world at a distance behind the mirror as it is our direct vision of the chair when we turn round and look at it. Pure presentational immediacy refuses to be divided into delusions and not delusions. It is either all of it or none of it, an immediate presentation of an external contemporary world as in its own right spatial. The sense data involved in presentational immediacy have a wider relationship in the world than these contemporary things can express. In abstraction from this wider relationship, there is no means of determining the importance of the apparent qualification of contemporary objects by sense data. For this reason, the phrase mere appearance carries the suggestion of barrenness. This wider relationship of the sense data can only be understood by examining the alternative mode of perception, the mode of causal efficacy. But insofar as contemporary things are bound together by mere presentational immediacy, they happen in complete independence except for their spatial relations at the moment. Also, for most events, we presume that their intrinsic experience of presentational immediacy is so embryonic as to be negligible. This perceptive mode is important only for a small minority of elaborate organisms. In this explanation of presentational immediacy, I am conforming to the distinction according to which actual things are objectively in our experience and formally existing in their own completeness. I maintain that presentational immediacy is that peculiar way in which contemporary things are objectively in our experience, and that among the abstract entities which constitute factors in the mode of introduction are those abstractions usually called sense data, for example, colors, sounds, tastes, touches, and bodily feelings. Thus, objectification itself is abstraction, since no actual thing is objectified in its formal completeness. Abstraction expresses nature's mode of interaction, and is not merely mental. When it abstracts, thought is merely conforming to nature, or rather it is exhibiting itself as an element in nature. The conception of the world here adopted is that of functional activity. By this I mean that every actual thing is something by reason of its activity, whereby its nature consists in its relevance to other things, and its individuality consists in its synthesis of other things so far as they are relevant to it. In inquiring about any one individual, we must ask how other individuals enter objectively into the unity of its own experience. This unity of its own experience is that individual existing formally. We must also inquire how it enters into the formal existence of other things. And this entrance is that individual existing objectively, that is to say, existing abstractly, exemplifying only some elements in its formal content. With this conception of the world, in speaking of any actual individual, such a human being, we must mean that man, in one occasion of his experience. Such an occasion or act is complex and therefore capable of analysis into phases and other components. It is the most concrete actual entity, and the life of man from birth to death is a historic route of such occasions. These concrete moments are bound together into one society by a partial identity of form, and by the peculiarly full summation of its predecessors, which each moment of the life history gathers into itself. The man at one moment concentrates in himself the color of his own past, and he is the issue of it. The man in his whole life history is an abstraction compared to the man in one such moment. There are therefore three different meanings for the notion of a particular man. Julius Caesar, for example. The word Caesar may mean Caesar in some one occasion of his existence. This is the most concrete of all meanings. The word Caesar may mean the historic route of Caesar's life from his Caesarean birth to his Caesarean assassination. The word Caesar may mean the common form or pattern repeated in each occasion of Caesar's life. This doctrine of the nature of the life history of an enduring organism holds for all types of organisms, which have attained to unity in experience for electrons as well as for men. But mankind has gained a richness of experiential content denied to electrons. This lecture has maintained the doctrine of a direct experience of an external world. My second thesis is that if you consistently maintain such direct individual experience, you will be driven in your philosophical construction to a conception of the world as an interplay of functional activity, whereby each concrete individual thing arises from its determinate relativity to the settled world of other concrete individuals, at least so far as the world is past and settled. It is the thesis of this work that human symbolism has its origin in the symbolic interplay between two distinct modes of direct perception of the external world. They are, in this way, two sources of information about the external world, closely connected but distinct. These modes do not repeat each other, and there is a real diversity of information. Where one is vague, the other is precise. Where one is important, the other is trivial. But the two schemes of presentation have structural elements in common, which identify them as schemes of presentation of the same world. There are, however, gaps in the determination of the correspondence between the two morphologies. The schemes only partially intersect, and their true fusion is left indeterminate. The symbolic reference leads to a transference of emotion, purpose, and belief, which cannot be justified by an intellectual comparison of the direct information derived from the two schemes and their elements of intersection. The justification, such as it is, must be sought in a pragmatic appeal to the future. In this way, intellectual criticism founded on subsequent experience can enlarge and purify the primitive, naive symbolic transference. I have termed one perceptive mode presentational immediacy and the other mode causal efficacy. It will be evident to you that I am here controverting the most cherished tradition of modern philosophy shared alike by the school of empiricists, which derives from Hume, and the school of transcendental idealists, which derives from Kant. Hume writes, "When both the objects are present to the senses, along with the relation, we call this perception rather than reasoning. Nor is there in this case any exercise of the thought, or any action properly speaking, but a mere passive admission of the impressions through the organs of sensation. According to this way of thinking, we ought not to receive as reasoning any of the observations we may make concerning identity and the relations of time and place, since in none of them the mind can go beyond what is immediately present to the senses, either to discover the real existence or the relations of objects." The whole force of this passage depends upon the tacit presupposition of the mind as a passively receptive substance, and its impression as forming its private world of accidents. There then remains nothing except the immediacy of these private attributes with their private relations, which are also attributes of the mind. Hume on substance. I would fain ask those philosophers who found so much of their reasonings on the distinction of substance and accident, and imagine we have clear ideas of each, whether the idea of substance be derived from the impressions of sensation or reflection. If it be conveyed to us by our senses, I ask, which of them, and after what manner? If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be color. If by the ears, a sound. If by the palate, a taste. And so of the other senses. But I believe none will assert that substance is a color, or sound, or a taste. The idea of substance must, therefore, be derived from an impression of reflection, if it really exist. But the impressions of reflection resolve themselves into our passions and emotions, none of which can possibly represent a substance. We have, therefore, no idea of substance distinct from that of a collection of particular qualities, nor have we any other meaning when we either talk or reason concerning it. This passage is concerned with the notion of substance, which I do not entertain. Thus it only indirectly controverts my position. I quote it because it is the plainest example of Hume's initial assumptions that one, presentational immediacy and relations between presentationally immediate entities constitute the only type of perceptive experience, and that, two, presentational immediacy includes no demonstrative factors disclosing a contemporary world of extended actual things. These conclusions rest upon an extraordinary, naive assumption of time as pure succession. The assumption is naive because it is the natural thing to say. It is natural because it leaves out a characteristic of time which is so intimately interwoven that it is natural to omit it. Time in the concrete is the conformation of state to state. The latter to the earlier, and the pure succession is an abstraction from the irreversible relationship of settled past to derivative present. The notion of pure succession is analogous to the notion of color. There is no mere color, but always some particular color, such as red or blue. Analogously, there is no pure succession, but always some particular relational ground in respect to which the terms succeed each other. The integers succeed each other in one way, and events succeed each other in another way. And when we abstract from these ways of succession, we find that pure succession is an abstraction of the second order, a generic abstraction, omitting the temporal character of time and the numerical relation of integers. The past consists of the community of settled acts, which through their objectification in the present act establish the conditions to which that act must conform. The immediate present has to conform to what the past is for it, and the mere lapse of time is an abstraction from the more concrete relatedness of conformation. The substantial character of actual things is not primarily concerned with the predication of qualities it expresses, the stubborn fact that whatever is settled and actual must in due measure be conformed to by the self-creative activity. The phrase stubborn fact exactly expresses the popular apprehension of this characteristic, its primary phase from which each actual thing arises is the stubborn fact which underlies its existence. According to Hume, there are no stubborn facts. Hume's doctrine may be good philosophy, but it is certainly not common sense. In other words, it fails before the final test of obvious verification. The Kantian doctrine accepts Hume's naive presupposition of simple occurrence for the mere data. I have elsewhere called it the assumption of simple location by way of applying it to space as well as to time. I directly deny this doctrine of simple occurrence. There is nothing which simply happens. Such a belief is the baseless doctrine of time as pure succession. The alternative doctrine that the pure succession of time is merely an abstract form from the fundamental relationship, conformation, sweeps away the whole basis for the intervention of constitutive thought or constitutive intuition in the formation of the directly apprehended world. Universality of thought arises from the universality of relativity, whereby each particular actual thing lays upon the universe the obligation of conforming to it. Thus, in the analysis of particular fact, universal truths are discoverable, those truths expressing this obligation. The givenness of experience, that is to say, all its data alike, whether general truths or particular sensa or presupposed forms of synthesis, expresses the specific character of the temporal relation of that act of experience to the settled actuality of the universe which is the source of all conditions. The fallacy of misplaced concreteness abstracts from time this specific character and leaves time with the mere generic character of pure succession. The followers of Hume and the followers of Kant have thus their diverse but allied objections to the notion of any direct perception of causal efficacy, in the sense in which direct perception is antecedent to thought about it. Both schools find causal efficacy to be the importation into the data of a way of thinking or judging about those data. One school calls it a habit of thought, the other school calls it a category of thought. Also for them, the mere data are the pure sense data. For according to these accounts, causal efficacy is nothing else than a way of thinking about sense data, given in presentational immediacy. The logical difficulties attending the direct perception of causal efficacy have been shown to depend on the sheer assumption that time is merely the generic notion of pure succession. This is an instance of the fallacy of misplaced concreteness. Thus the way is now open to inquire empirically whether in fact our apprehension of causal efficacy does depend either on the vividness of sense data or on the activity of thought. My point is that this conformation of present fact to immediate past is more prominent both in apparent behavior and in consciousness when the organism is low grade. A flower turns to the light with much greater certainty than does a human being, and a stone conforms to the conditions set by its external environment with much greater certainty than does a flower. The perception of conformation to realities and the environment is the primitive element in our external experience. We conform to our bodily organs and to the vague world which lies beyond them. Our primitive perception is that of conformation vaguely, and of the yet vaguer relata to oneself and another in the undiscriminated background. Of course, if relationships are unperceivable, such doctrine must be ruled out on theoretic grounds. But if we admit such perception, then the perception of conformation has every mark of a primitive element. One part of our experience is handy and definite in our consciousness. Also, it is easy to reproduce at will. The other type of experience, however insistent, is vague, haunting, unmanageable. The former type, for all its decorative sense experience, is barren. It displays a world concealed under an adventitious show, a show of our own bodily production. The latter type is heavy with the contact of the things gone by, which lay their grip on our immediate selves. This latter type, the mode of causal efficacy, is the experience dominating the primitive living organisms, which have a sense for the fate from which they have emerged and for the fate towards which they go. The organisms which advance and retreat but hardly differentiate any immediate display. It is a heavy, primitive experience. The former type, the presentational immediacy, is the superficial product of complexity of subtlety. It halts at the present and indulges in a manageable self-enjoyment derived from the immediacy of the show of things, those periods in our lives when the perception of the pressure from a world of things with characters in their own right, characters mysteriously molding our own natures, becomes strongest. Those periods are the product of a reversion to some primitive state. Such a reversion occurs when either some primitive functioning of the human organism is unusually heightened, or some considerable part of our habitual sense perception is unusually enfeebled. Anger, hatred, fear, terror, attraction, love, hunger, eagerness, massive enjoyment are feelings and emotions closely entwined with the primitive functioning of retreat from and of expansion towards. They arise in the higher organism as states due to a vivid apprehension that some primitive mode of functioning is dominating the organism, but retreat from and expansion towards, divested of any detailed spatial discrimination, are merely reactions to the way externality is impressing on us its own character. You cannot retreat from mere subjectivity, for subjectivity is what we carry with us. Normally, we have almost negligible sense presentations of the interior organs of our own bodies. These primitive emotions are accompanied by the clearest recognition of other actual things reacting upon ourselves. The vulgar obviousness of such recognition is equal to the vulgar obviousness produced by the functioning of any one of our five senses. When we hate, it is a man that we hate, and not a collection of sense data, a causal, efficacious man. This primitive obviousness of the perception of conformation is illustrated by the emphasis on the pragmatic aspect of occurrences, which is so prominent in modern philosophical thought. There can be no useful aspect of anything unless we admit the principle of conformation, whereby what is already made becomes a determinant of what is in the making. The obviousness of the pragmatic aspect is simply the obviousness of the perception of the fact of conformation. The world given in sense perception is not the aboriginal experience of the lower organisms, later to be sophisticated by the inference to causal efficacy. The contrary is the case. First, the causal side of experience is dominating, then the sense presentation gains in subtlety. Their mutual symbolic reference is finally purged by consciousness and the critical reason, with the aid of a pragmatic appeal to consequences. The intersection of the modes of perception. There cannot be symbolic reference between percepts derived from one mode and percepts from the other mode, unless in some way these percepts intersect. By this intersection I mean that a pair of such percepts must have elements of structure in common, whereby they are marked out for the action of symbolic reference. There are two elements of common structure, which can be shared in common by a percept derived from presentational immediacy, and by another derived from causal efficacy. These elements are 1, sense data, and 2, locality. The sense data are given for presentational immediacy. This givenness of sense data as the basis of this perceptive mode is the great doctrine common to Hume and Kant, but what is already given for experience can only be derived from that natural potentiality which shapes a particular experience in the guise of causal efficacy. Causal efficacy is the hand of the settled past in the formation of the present. The sense data must therefore play a double role in perception. In the mode of presentational immediacy, they are projected to exhibit the contemporary world in its spatial relations. In the mode of causal efficacy, they exhibit the almost instantaneously precedent bodily organs, as imposing their characters on the experience in question. We see the picture, and we see it with our eyes. We touch the wood, and we touch it with our hands. In the case of bodily feelings, the two locations are identical. The foot is both giving pain and is the seat of pain. Hume himself tacitly asserts this double reference in the second of the quotations previously made. He writes, "If it be perceived by the eyes, it must be a color, if by the ears a sound, if by the palate a taste, and so of the other senses." Thus in asserting the lack of perception, of causality, he implicitly presupposes it. For what is the meaning of by, and by the eyes, by the ears, by the palate? His argument presupposes that sense data functioning in presentational immediacy are given by reason of eyes, ears, palates functioning in causal efficacy. Otherwise his argument is involved in a vicious regress, for it must begin again over eyes, ears, palates. Also it must explain the meaning of by and must, in a sense which does not destroy his argument. This double reference is the basis of the whole physiological doctrine of perception. The details of this doctrine are in this discussion philosophically irrelevant. Hume, with the clarity of genius, states the fundamental point, that sense data functioning in an active experience demonstrate that they are given by the causal efficacy of actual bodily organs. He refers to this causal efficacy as a component in direct perception. Hume's argument first tacitly presupposes the two modes of perception, and then tacitly assumes that presentational immediacy is the only mode. So far as Hume's own teaching is concerned, there is another alternative. It is that Hume's disciples have misinterpreted Hume's final position. On this hypothesis, his final appeal to practice is an appeal against the adequacy of then current metaphysical categories, as interpretive of obvious experience. This theory about Hume's own beliefs is, in my opinion, improbable, but apart from Hume's own estimate of his philosophical achievement, it is in this sense that we must reverence him as one of the greatest of philosophers. The conclusion of this argument is that the intervention of any sense datum in the actual world cannot be expressed in any simple way, such as mere qualification of a region of space, or alternatively as the mere qualification of a state of mind. The partial community of structure, whereby the two perceptive modes yield immediate demonstration of a common world, arises from their reference of sense data, common to both two localizations, diverse or identical, in a spatio-temporal system common to both. For example, color is referred to an external space and to the eyes as organs of vision, insofar as we are dealing with one or the other of these pure perceptive modes. Such reference is direct demonstration, and as isolated in conscious analysis is ultimate fact against which there is no appeal. Such isolation, or at least some approach to it, is fairly easy in the case of presentational immediacy, but is very difficult in the case of causal efficacy. Complete ideal purity of perceptive experience, devoid of any symbolic reference, is in practice unobtainable for either perceptive mode. Our judgments on causal efficacy are almost inextricably warped by the acceptance of the symbolic reference between the two modes as the completion of our direct knowledge. This acceptance is not merely in thought, but also in action, emotion, and purpose, all precedents to thought. This symbolic reference is a datum for thought in its analysis of experience. By trusting this datum, our conceptual scheme of the universe is in general logically coherent with itself, and is correspondent to the ultimate facts of the pure perceptive modes. But occasionally, either the coherence or the verification fails. We then revise our conceptual scheme so as to preserve the general trust in the symbolic reference, while relegating definite details of that reference to the category of errors. Such errors are termed delusive appearances. This error arises from the extreme vagueness of the spatial and temporal perspectives in the case of perception, in the pure mode of causal efficacy. There is no adequate definition of localization, so far as what emerges into analytic consciousness. The principle of relativity leads us to hold that, with adequate conscious analysis, such local relationships leave their faint impress in experience. But in general, such detailed analysis is far beyond the capacity of human consciousness. So far as concerns the causal efficacy of the world external to the human body, there is the most insistent perception of a circumambient, efficacious world of beings, but exact discrimination of thing from thing, and of position from position, is extremely vague, almost negligible. The definite discrimination, which in fact we do make, arises almost wholly by reason of symbolic reference. From presentational immediacy, the case is different with respect to the human body. There is still vagueness in comparison with the accurate definition of immediate presentation. Although the locality of various bodily organs, which are efficacious in the regulation of sense data and of the feelings, are fairly well defined in the pure perceptive mode of causal efficacy, the symbolic transference, of course, intensifies the definition. But apart from such transference, there is some adequacy of definite demarcation. Thus, in the intersection of the two modes, the spatial and the temporal relationships of the human body as causally apprehended to the external contemporary world as immediately presented afford a fairly definite scheme of spatial and temporal reference, whereby we test the symbolic use of sense projection for the determination of the positions of bodies controlling the course of nature. Ultimately, all observation, scientific or popular, consists in the determination of the spatial relation of the bodily organs of the observer to the location of projected sense data. The reason why the projected sense data are in general used as symbol is that they are handy, definite, and manageable. We can see or not see as we like. We can hear or not hear. There are limits to this handiness of sense data, but they are emphatically the manageable elements in our perceptions of the world. The sense of controlling presences has the contrary character. It is unmanageable, vague, and ill-defined. But for all their vagueness, for all their lack of definition, these controlling presences, these sources of power, these things with an inner life, with their own richness of content, these beings, with the destiny of the world hidden in their natures, are what we want to know about. As we cross a road busy with traffic, we see the color of the cars, their shapes, the gay colors of their occupants. But at the moment we are absorbed in using this immediate show as a symbol for the forces determining the immediate future. We enjoy the symbol, but we also penetrate to the meaning. The symbols do not create their meaning. The meaning, in the form of actual, effective beings reacting upon us, exists for us in its own right. But the symbols discover this meaning for us. They discover it because, in the long course of adaptation of living organisms to their environment, nature, taught their use. It developed us so that our projected sensations indicate in general those regions which are the seat of important organisms. Our relationships to these bodies are precisely our reactions to them. The projection of our sensations is nothing else than the illustration of the world in partial accordance with the systematic scheme, in space and in time, to which these reactions conform. The bonds of causal efficacy arise from without us. They disclose the character of the world from which we issue, an inescapable condition, round which we shape ourselves. The bonds of presentational immediacy arise from within us, and are subject to intensifications and inhibitions and diversions according as we accept their challenge or reject it. The sense data are not properly to be termed mere impressions, except so far as any technical term will do. They also represent the conditions arising out of the active perceptive functioning, as conditioned by our own natures. But our natures must conform to the causal efficacy. Thus, the causal efficacy from the past is at least one factor giving our presentational immediacy in the present. The how of our present experience must conform to the what of the past in us. Our experience arises out of the past. It enriches with emotion and purpose its presentation of the contemporary world, and it bequeaths its character to the future, in the guise of an effective element forever adding to or subtracting from the richness of the world for good or for evil. Conclusion. In this chapter and in the former chapter, the general character of symbolism has been discussed. It plays a dominant part in the way in which all higher organisms conduct their lives. It is the cause of progress and the cause of error. The higher animals have gained a faculty of great power by means of which they can define, with some accuracy, those distant features in the immediate world, by which their future lives are to be determined, but this faculty is not infallible, and the risks are commensurate with its importance.